Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family member? No names, just yes or no.
My son is gone because my parents said they could not afford to help, and I can still hear the words they used the day I begged them for just a little support, as if they had practiced their lines ahead of time. As if they had already decided my child's survival was too expensive to fit into their picture of what family means. I had walked into their kitchen clutching the paperwork from the hospital, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the pages steady, and I told them that the insurance would not cover everything, that the treatments could give him more time, maybe even a chance at a normal life, and that I just needed help bridging the gap. My dad folded his hands in front of him like he was at church. My mom kept repeating that things were tight, that they wished it were different, that life was unfair sometimes. They spoke gently, almost rehearsed, telling me that they loved us, but simply did not have the means, and I left their house that night with a pit in my stomach. So heavy I could barely breathe, wondering how in the world I would make it work alone. What people don't understand until they live it is that when you're faced with the possibility of losing your child, you stop thinking in terms of what's logical or fair, and you start thinking in terms of how much you can endure, how far you can stretch yourself, how much sleep, dignity, and sanity you can sacrifice if it might mean they stay alive. I sold my car, I picked up every extra shift I could find, I drained what little savings I had, and I borrowed money from friends I was embarrassed to even ask. I watched my son's body fight harder than I thought a child ever could, and at night I would sit in the chair next to his bed in the hospital, running through numbers in my head like an accountant on the edge of madness, convincing myself that if I just stayed strong a little longer, we would somehow break through the impossible wall that money had placed between us and hope. Meanwhile, every time I saw my sister, she seemed to be floating through life without the same weight on her shoulders, showing up at family dinners with new gadgets or talking about her latest trips like she was living in a different world altogether. I told myself not to resent her because she didn't owe me anything, and maybe she had figured out a way to make her life easier that I simply hadn't discovered. But deep down there was this nagging voice that wondered why the universe was so cruelly tilted in her direction while I was crawling on my knees just to buy a few more days with my son. My parents would brag about how resourceful she was, how independent, how she was making something of herself, and I sat there biting my tongue, knowing I could never say what I really wanted to say, which was that independence looks different when you know someone will catch you if you fall, while I was falling with no safety net in sight. The day the doctor told me we had run out of time, that there were no more treatments left, that I could only make him comfortable, I felt something inside me snap, but it wasn't a clean break. It was 1,000 tiny fractures that made me feel like glass, like I could shatter completely at the slightest touch. I called my parents that night, and I told them through tears that their grandson was dying, and my dad's response was, "We are so sorry, we did everything we could," and my mom whispered, "God has a plan." I wanted to scream because they had not done everything they could, not even close, and as for God's plan, all I could think was that maybe his plan would have looked a little different if they had cared enough to step up when it mattered. At the funeral, they stood at the front like grieving grandparents who had carried the same burden I had, hugging guests, receiving sympathy, putting on a show of heartbreak, while I sat numb in the pew wondering how many of these people knew the truth. How many realized that the tears rolling down my parents' cheeks came from the same faces that had turned me away when I asked for help? I swallowed the anger because what was I going to do? Stand up in front of the coffin and announce that the child everyone was mourning might still be alive if his own grandparents hadn't decided he was too expensive to save? I told myself it wasn't the time, it wasn't the place, and so I kept my silence, but inside of me, the resentment began to grow roots so deep I knew it wasn't going anywhere. When the crowd dispersed and the last car pulled out of the parking lot, I stayed by his grave longer than anyone else, pressing my palm against the dirt like I could still reach him if I just tried hard enough. And in that moment, I promised myself that one day the truth would come out, that I would not go to my own grave carrying this weight alone. My parents thought they had shut the door on the conversation forever when they told me we did everything we could, but what they didn't know was that I had already begun to notice cracks in their story, details that didn't add up. Things I was too exhausted to question at the time but would later come back to haunt them. And so I walked away from that funeral not just as a grieving mother, but as a woman quietly preparing for a reckoning, one that my parents would never see coming. Grief does not have a polite way of leaving. It lingers in the corners of your life like a bill you keep moving from one stack to another, and after the funeral when the food containers were cleaned and the sympathy cards were tucked away, my parents drifted back into their comfortable routine with an ease that made me feel like I had dreamed the whole nightmare, while my sister resumed her charmed rhythm of posts, dinners, and stories that never included early mornings at work or late nights. Paying anything off, and I kept trying to convince myself that none of it meant anything, that people cope in different ways, that I would not turn into the bitter woman who cannot sit through a family meal without tasting salt in every bite. It helped exactly until the first family gathering when my mom bragged that my sister had found a lovely place near the river and was finally stabilizing, a word that did not match anything I knew about her sporadic income. And it scraped against the memory of my dad telling me there was no way they could help with my son's treatment because they were barely staying afloat themselves, which would be a lot more believable if they were not ordering catered food and planning a vacation. They insisted they could not cancel because it was already paid for, and even though I stayed quiet, I felt the first real tear in whatever patience I had left. I started to notice the small pieces people drop when they get comfortable, like how my sister let slip that her security deposit had been a nightmare until someone fixed it, or how my mom mentioned paying a late fee, with the same tone she uses to describe picking up a carton of milk, and when my aunt asked my dad how the renovation on their bathroom was going, and he said it was a gift to themselves after a hard year. I remembered the exact month that I had asked for help and they had told me that even an extra 100 would jeopardize their mortgage, which suddenly sounded less like truth and more like a convenient line they had settled on. I did not turn into a detective overnight. I am not that dramatic, but I did start keeping a quiet ledger in my head and, eventually, on paper, because when people gaslight you with smiles, you need something solid to keep you from doubting your own sanity. So I wrote down dates of dinners where new trips were mentioned, the day my sister flashed a key fob from a secured building and said parking was included, the time my mom waved away a check at a restaurant because she had points, and the afternoon I helped my dad set up his tablet for a slideshow and an alert popped up for a bank transfer labeled with my sister's initials and the word rent, a moment I tried to pretend I had not seen even as my stomach went cold. I told myself that maybe it was a one-time thing, that parents helped their kids and maybe they were embarrassed to admit it to me because of everything that had happened. But then I overheard a phone call where my mom, with her bedroom door just barely cracked, whispered that she had handled the overdue notice from the clinic and that it was nobody's business as long as my sister stayed on track. And while I do not know what that meant and I will not pretend otherwise, the phrase overdue notice from the clinic did not sound like a routine wellness appointment, and the casual way she said it told me this was not the first bill that had landed in their laps. There is a specific kind of fury that comes when people who denied you in your darkest hours speak about money like it is elastic, and I felt it building as I checked the calendar and saw the date my son's memorial invoice for the headstone balance was due. A small amount compared to what I knew a downtown security deposit looked like, so I called my parents and asked, in the same careful voice they had used with me, whether they could contribute to the memorial fund that would ensure his name would be carved and sealed before winter, and when they hesitated and then said they were sorry, but they had taken on some obligations for the next few months, I said that I understood and thanked them for their time. And then I did something that was not kind, but felt necessary for my own sanity. I set up a family group message for the memorial fund and, because I am done apologizing for existing, I shared the link and publicly thanked, one by one, the people who had already contributed, old friends from school, a nurse from the unit who remembered my son's laugh, a neighbor who does not have much but shows up, and I let the message sit without adding anything passive-aggressive, knowing that silence sometimes says more than a speech, and when my sister wrote back asking if I was doing this for attention, I replied that attention is what you seek when you throw a party, while I was simply making sure my son was not forgotten, and then I muted the conversation and watched, over the next day, as relatives donated small amounts and left notes about love and memory, while my parents sat on their hands and said nothing at all. If you want to call that petty, I will not argue, but it worked like a pressure test on a pipe, because within a week I got a call from my aunt who accidentally forwarded me a voicemail from my mom where she said she had wired money again and that this would clear the slate for my sister if she stayed quiet about the apartment issue and the thing at the clinic, which told me there were slates and issues and things plural, and that their supposed poverty had always been a choice about priorities rather than a fact of life, and that knowledge did not bring my son back, but it did give me clarity, and clarity is gasoline when you are holding a match. So I started planning the kind of truth that does not just leak but detonates, and as I sat in my living room with a notebook, writing down confirmation after confirmation, the phone lit up with a save the date for a family celebration where my parents would be hosting and my sister would be honored for turning a corner, and I looked at the screen for a long time, thinking about corners and who gets to announce that they have turned them. And then I smiled in a way that did not feel nice at all, because I knew exactly what I would do when the toasts began and the room leaned in to hear what a wonderful family we were, and what a miracle it was that everything had somehow worked out. I did not wake up one morning and decide to become some brilliant investigator, because grief doesn't hand you a badge or a rule book, it hands you a knot that refuses to loosen until you start pulling at every thread. And that is how I found myself building a quiet timeline that began with the day my parents told me they could not help and stretched forward across months of little remarks, odd transfers, and careful whispers. A timeline I sketched in a notebook because writing it down kept me from believing their version of events, where money is always a ghost that appears for one child and vanishes for the other. The first thread came from something painfully ordinary, my dad asking me to help him organize files on his tablet because the photos from a vacation would not sync, and while I moved folders and cleaned up his downloads, an email preview slid across the screen from the bank with a subject line that read "Transfer Confirmation," and the snippet showed my sister's initials and a note that said "Rent," which he tried to swipe away like a fly before I could read it. But the image burned into my head anyway, so I finished the favor, handed him the tablet, and went home to write down the date, the sender, and the amount I could not see but could easily imagine. Because rent in a secure building with covered parking is not spare change you pull from the couch cushions. The next thread was a story my sister loved telling about how she had negotiated her security deposit down because she is great with people, a line that would be harmless if my mother had not, that same week, mentioned in passing that she would need to check on the transfer before the first, phrased like a chore she kept forgetting to complete, and when I asked what she meant she gave me the kind of smile people use when they want the conversation to die, the soft, dismissive one that says, "We are not discussing this with you," which is how you learn that some doors will only open if you stop asking permission and start trying keys you already have in your pocket. One of those keys turned out to be public records that confirm the leaseholder of a property, not the most detailed information in the world, but enough to show me that the apartment my sister bragged about was in a building where the primary lease was held by a corporate name that links back to a holding my parents have used for years to claim deductions on small rental units and renovations. A structure I only knew about because I used to help them submit paperwork after they retired and decided they were dabbling in small investments, and while I am not a lawyer and I am not making accusations, I am capable of noticing when a dabble turns into a pipeline. And I am capable of seeing how a pipeline can carry money from a property line straight into a lifestyle someone else pretends is self-made. Another thread came in the form of the voicemail my aunt forwarded by mistake, the one where my mom's voice dropped to that secret low tone as she said she had covered the overdue at the clinic again, and that this would clear the slate if she stays quiet about the apartment issue, words that felt like puzzle pieces from a picture I did not want to see, because you do not repeatedly cover overdue bills at a clinic for someone who is perfectly stable. And you do not talk about slates and issues if you are helping with basic health. You talk like that when you are mopping up messes and you are tired of scrubbing, and while I do not need to know the exact nature of those messes to understand their cost, I do know what it feels like to be told there is nothing to spare while a different ledger keeps getting reset to zero. I wanted more than rumors and hunches, so I asked for copies of the memorial paperwork for my son because the cemetery had made a tiny error on the engraving draft, and the staffer, who remembered us, handed me the folder they kept on file with our entire email chain printed and stapled, and tucked inside was my original note where I had asked, in the most careful words I could manage, if my parents could contribute even a little to ensure the headstone would be finished before winter followed. By the polite reply where I explained I would cover the balance myself, and seeing that black and white record of my begging next to a photo of the finished stone should have been enough to break me, yet instead it made me sharper. Because written proof is a mirror that does not lie, and once you see your reflection in it, you stop apologizing for how you look. I layered these pieces with screenshots I took from a family rewards portal that my father asked me to set up last year, the one that aggregates cashback redemptions and travel points, where I could see, without digging into anything private, the redemption dates that lined up with weekends my parents swore they were home and relaxing, and I stacked those dates against the text messages where my mother told me they could not help because they were waiting on a large bill, a phrase that, as it turns out, can mean anything you want it to mean when your priorities are elastic, and by the time I finished, the notebook in my lap looked less like a journal and more like a ledger. A map of choices that always bent toward my sister's comfort and away from my child's life. It is one thing to know, and another thing to make people feel what you now know, so my small act of revenge for that week was not loud or dramatic. It was a message I crafted carefully and sent only to my parents from a private link, a clean, simple gallery that looked like a family album but opened, slide by slide, into labeled screenshots of transfers and points redemptions and the voicemail transcript, all framed by my original emails and the memorial invoice, and at the end of the gallery, I wrote that I would be attending the celebration, that I planned to offer a toast in honor of truth, and that if they believed any single item was inaccurate, they were welcome to bring their receipts and explain them to the same relatives who had written notes to my son. Because I am done being the only person in this family who has to prove she is telling the truth. They did not respond that night or the next, but my sister sent me a breezy text about dress codes and photo booths and how she hoped I would be fun this time, which told me everything I needed to know about how the story would go if I stayed quiet. And while I do not yet know what the clinic bills covered or how many months of rent were secretly paid or which slates were wiped clean, I know enough to end the myth at its source, because I am bringing the gallery to the party in a form that one can ignore, and when the host asks for toasts, I will not be raising my glass to celebrate a corner turned. I will be placing my hand on the microphone and asking my parents whether they want to speak first or whether they would prefer that I read their lines for them. The invitation to the celebration landed in my messages with the kind of cheerful wording that makes your jaw tighten, because it was all about new beginnings and turning corners, and how proud everyone was of the progress my sister had made. And while the old version of me might have hovered over the decline button or sent a polite excuse about work, the woman who now lives on the other side of a headstone opened a notebook instead and began mapping the room before I ever saw it, sketching a plan that would let the truth walk in on its own legs and take a seat at every table, even if the hosts preferred the chairs to stay empty of anything but praise. I started with the projector because people will believe anything if it arrives in a slideshow with soft music and slow crossfades. So I reached out to the cousin who always handles tech at these events and said that I wanted to add a short gratitude reel that would honor the friends and helpers who kept me upright when I could not feel my own feet. And he agreed without hesitation because he is decent and because grief has made me hard to refuse. And then I built the reel so it looked like a tribute to kindness, which it was, but it also carried within it the clean bones of a ledger, a series of screens that looked like thank you cards until they quietly shifted into quotes, dates, and confirmations that no longer fit the family story once they were placed side by side. I printed, not screenshots with account numbers and drama, because I am not reckless, but clear reproductions that any adult could understand without feeling like I had rifled through drawers, including my original emails asking for help, the polite refusals from my parents, the memorial invoices I paid alone, and public records linking the apartment shell to a holding my parents have used for years, and I sealed them into simple envelopes with the names of a few relatives who have always claimed to value honesty over harmony, asking those relatives to open them only after my toast, because I wanted them to hear the words first and see the paper second. A choreography designed to leave no space for the usual smoke that fills the room when people start talking about intentions instead of outcomes. I secured the microphone time with the venue by using the one thing hosts cannot resist, the promise of a heartfelt moment in the program that would keep people attentive and generous. And I wrote a short introduction that sounded like sugar from the front, but carried in its center the small stone that would tip the balance, a sentence that thanked our family for showing up for one another in the ways that matter, followed by a pivot that asked whether we would all agree that the most important way to show up is to tell the truth when the truth costs something, a pivot I practiced out loud until the words landed in a single breath without a tremor, because nothing blunts a blade like a shaking hand. I thought about the guests and arranged my allies the way a person arranges candles to make a dark room readable, asking the nurse who sat in my son's room on nights when the monitors would not settle to come as my companion and to sit by the door where the goodbyes happen. Asking the neighbor who mowed my lawn when the grass reached my knees to take a table near my parents where he could look them in the eye, and asking my aunt, who is not brave but hates lies, to agree that if anyone tried to cut my microphone, she would stand and ask whether the hosts could at least let me finish the sentence before they rewrote it, and with those small placements I felt the air shift into something that favored straight lines over circles. For a small, sharp act before the storm, I delivered a wrapped frame to my parents earlier that week, a tasteful piece with 2 windows under a single sheet of glass, and in one window I placed the memorial proof with my son's name etched the way we chose it, and in the other I placed my original email asking whether they could help cover treatments that might buy him time, and when my mother called to say it was lovely and that she would treasure it, I thanked her in a voice as clean as I could keep it and said that treasuring the frame would be easier if she also treasured context, a sentence that made her pause long enough to tell me she looked forward to seeing me at the party and hoped we could keep things light, which I translated as a request that I leave my spine at home. I arrived early and watched my sister move through the room with the shine of someone who believes in her own myth, listened to my father greet people with that deep, warm voice that can convince a stranger that he has never missed a mortgage payment or a bedtime story. And I pressed my palm against the notebook in my bag without needing to open it, because the facts had already climbed into my bones and set up camp there, and when the first round of toasts began I could feel the old habit tugging at me, the one that says be polite, eat the food, go home, cry in the shower, and start the week over, yet the newer habit was stronger, the one that says say the thing, show the thing, let the room choose which version of the family they prefer to live with. When the host called my name, I walked up without asking permission from any second thoughts, and I took the microphone and thanked the room in a tone that made even the cousins who avoid eye contact look up. And I said that I wanted to talk about gratitude because that is what this celebration is supposed to be about, and then I said that gratitude dies when it is built on a lie. And as a few heads tilted like birds hearing a distant noise, I nodded to my cousin at the projector table, who lifted the remote for the reel we had cued as the next surprise, and while the music swelled and the first images of friends and neighbors filled the screen, I felt my mother's hand clutch my wrist as if she could guide me off the stage by the pulse. And I leaned into the microphone and asked, clear enough for the back tables, whether my parents would like to say a few words about how they show up for family or whether they would prefer that I let the reel finish the sentence for them, and then I let the room hold its breath while the opening slide brightened into the frame that would not blink when the truth finally stepped into the light. The reel began the way every family loves to see itself, with smiling faces and neighbors who showed up and the nurse from my son's unit waving at the camera because she hates being photographed. And I let it run that way long enough to disarm the room before the crossfade slowed and the caption shifted from "Thank you for holding me up" to "This is what I asked for when I begged," and then the image of the memorial invoice slid in beside the email where I wrote, carefully and humbly, that any help, even a little, could buy my child time, followed by the reply that there was nothing to spare and maybe next season would be easier, and while the room tried to decide whether this was still a gratitude reel or something else entirely, the next frame arrived with a clean label that said transfer confirmation and my sister's initials beside the word rent, dated the same week I was selling my car to keep the treatments going, and in that moment I did not raise my voice or point a finger. Because there is a particular power in letting arithmetic speak for you when emotion would be accused of exaggeration. My mother's hand tightened on my wrist as if she could squeeze the remote out of my cousin's palm from across the room. My father cleared his throat with the authority he uses when he wants a room to return to its old script. My sister laughed, that thin little laugh people use when they are buying time, and said that this was not fair because context matters, and I agreed that context is everything, which is why the following slides were not bank statements with account numbers or private medical details, but public records, transcribed voicemails, and my own emails, each one placed beside another so that they formed a sentence no one could rewrite. Beginning with the property record that links the apartment's corporate leaseholder to the family holding my parents have used for years, then the voicemail where my mother said she had covered the overdue at the clinic again, and that the slate would be clean if my sister stayed quiet about the apartment issue, and finally the dated text, where I asked whether they could contribute to the headstone and received the gentlest refusal I have ever read, because there is nothing softer than a no that dresses itself up as sympathy. When my father stepped forward and asked if we could take this outside, I said that the last time I took a life and death conversation outside, I walked back in to find a bill still unpaid and a calendar moving on without mercy. So today I would like to keep it inside the room where the speeches were supposed to celebrate how we show up for one another, and if anyone felt uncomfortable, they were free to be uncomfortable with me, because discomfort is the only honest reaction to a story whose arithmetic never quite balanced. And while a few chairs scraped and a cousin muttered that this was not the time or the place, my aunt, who hates confrontation but hates lies more, stood on cue and asked the hosts to let me finish one sentence before they rewrote it, which bought me just enough silence to nod toward the projector for the final sequence. The closing frames were not fireworks, but receipts of character, a series of small, unglamorous images that told the truth more cleanly than a confession. Like the neighbor's note from the memorial fund where he wrote that he did not have much, but he would not let a child's name go uncarved. The nurse's message about nights when she sat with my son so I could shower because insurance does not cover running water. And my own calendar screenshot of extra shifts stacked like bricks in a wall I never asked to build. And while those images held the room, I walked to the head table and placed 3 envelopes I had sealed earlier in the week in front of 3 relatives who announce at every holiday that they value honesty over harmony, asking each of them to open the envelope with their name and read the single page aloud, which they did, slowly and carefully, their voices moving through my original email, through the dates of the transfers, through the wording of the voicemail, and landing finally on the line where I wrote that grief does not sign non-disclosure agreements. My sister tried to spin, because that is her talent, saying the clinic bills were none of anyone's business and that she had been working on herself and that I was jeopardizing her progress. And I replied that I did not need to know what those bills were for to understand who paid them, and that progress funded by someone else while a child's treatment is declined is not a corner turned but a circle drawn. And then, before anyone could accuse me of wanting money now that the arithmetic was public, I said that I was neither asking for reimbursement nor threatening exposure beyond this room, that what I wanted was simple and could be handled in the next 10 minutes if the family really believed in turning corners. Because on the final slide there was a code and a link created for a pediatric fund in my son's name at the hospital we lived inside for too many months. And the venue had already agreed that the donation box and the tip jar at the bar would be routed there for the night, if the hosts approved, and I would stand here and wait to see whether they did. Silence can hum when a room recognizes a pivot it cannot gracefully refuse, and my father reached for the microphone with the reflex of a man used to guiding narratives, said that of course they would approve, that family takes care of family. That this was always the plan, and I let him have that line because the only thing I cared about was where the money went now, so I thanked the room, thanked the venue, nodded to my cousin to replace the slideshow with the donation instructions, and then I used the last seconds of my microphone time to ask one final, clean question that does not require context to answer, which was whether my parents could confirm, in front of the people they invite to every touchdown and anniversary, That on the week I begged for help, the transfer labeled rent went out, and on the month I asked about the headstone, they said no, and whether they were willing to say on record that both choices were, in their view, examples of showing up for family. They did not answer, not because they lacked words, but because every available word would either be a lie or a confession, and the room felt it. And that was the moment the celebration stopped being a celebration and turned into people staring at plates they no longer wanted. And then the unraveling began in the ordinary ways these things unravel, with a cousin grabbing her coat, a neighbor pressing cash into the donation box, the nurse hugging me like she was studying a patient before a move, my aunt telling my mother that love without truth is just decoration, and my sister walking toward the exit with the stiff, angry grace of someone who knows the myth will not hold outside the door. I did not make a scene or demand apologies or deliver a sermon. I thanked the staff for switching the box. I asked my cousin to email me the total at the end of the night. I hugged the people who had already shown up when it counted. And I walked out into a future that will be quiet in some ways and loud in others, knowing that I will never have the answer to what exactly the clinic bills were for, and that I do not need that answer to sleep, because the arithmetic is public now and the ledger has been read aloud. And while my parents may never speak to me again, and my sister will rewrite the story to anyone who will hear it, the bench with my son's name and the fund in his honor will exist without their permission. Which is not revenge in the cinematic sense, but it is the kind of justice that makes a person breathe again. And if you ask whether it was too far, I would tell you that it was exactly far enough to turn the table without flipping it, and that, finally, felt like a win I could live with.